This is macroeconomics, and we are going to be talking about the business cycle. There's actually not a chapter in the book on the business cycle. It's mentioned, but I think it's important enough for us to spend a little bit more time on this topic. We've already talked about GDP. You know how to measure it, its definition, and you know that's our measure of how an economy is doing. If our economy is growing, we're able to produce more goods and services. And we're looking at the percentage change of real GDP, so adjusted for inflation, from one period to the next. That can be by quarter or it can be by year. You also might recall that our goal for economic growth is 3%. Is our economic growth always sustained at the same rate? Are we always meeting our goal? No, absolutely not. I'm going to switch over to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, BEA.gov. And when you click on the report for GDP and go to one of the tables in the back, you can see these percentage change numbers. So in the first quarter of 2013, it is 1.1%. And this is, see that little R there? It's already a revised number. It looked a little bit better when that first number came out. So 1.1 now. 1%, 2.7, 1.6, as you see as I'm going backwards. Is it always the same? No. Are we always meeting our goal? No, we're definitely not right now. Now when you see a negative number here, you might have had to calculate a percentage change formula before in chemistry, or we used a percentage change formula when we were calculating inflation. You might recall that when we were calculating the inflation rate, it's the this year's CPI minus the previous year's divided by the previous year's. So if this year's number is greater than last year's, you're going to have a positive percentage change number. If this year's number is less than last year's, then you'll have a negative number on top. So when you've got that negative percentage change number like we do in the second quarter of 2009, that means our GDP actually declined. We didn't make as many goods and services as we did in the previous quarter. Now, these numbers up here only go up until the second quarter of 2009. Let me switch over to the document camera and you can see some earlier figures. Now, the Bureau of Economic Analysis goes through 2 revisions, and then it's the final number that's posted. So you might have noticed that when I was looking on the PDF on the screen before, that's at 0.8. So by the time that I had printed this in 2009 and the time they have revised it since I printed this out. So at the time this was 0.07, that was an earlier estimate, so the final number now is 0.8. But you can see these negative numbers here and just how bad it was in 2008 and 2009. So going back to the original question, is growth always sustained at the same rate? Absolutely not. Are we always meeting our goal? No. Come back over here to our slides. All right, our impressive long-run economic growth has been interrupted by periods of instability, so we're not always reaching our goal. And because we have sometimes negative percentage change numbers, sometimes it's positive, sometimes we reach our goal of 3, sometimes actually we grow a little bit faster. Well, these periods of instability and these alternating periods of rise and decline in economic activity is what we call the business cycle. Sometimes our economy grows, sometimes it shrinks, sometimes it contracts. How do we know? Our measure is real GDP. So when sometimes real GDP increases and sometimes it decreases from one period to the next, we just call that, those alternating periods of rise and decline, the business cycle. If the business cycle was nice and predictable, it might look something like this. So this is a model of what the business cycle looks like. So make sure you know the 4 phases of the business cycle. When we hit a minimum, it's our trough. In a period of growth, then that's expansion. Then we hit a maximum, that's the peak. And then when our economy starts to slow down, that's a recession. And then we start over again. So those are the 4 phases. You might recall from the PDF that I had up earlier, those were all positive percentage change numbers. So we are actually in an expansion period. That's the part of the business cycle that we are in right now. Not growing as fast as we need to help with the unemployment rate, but we are in a period of expansion with those positive percentage change numbers. Well, our business cycle doesn't look as nice and neat. You can see these jagged lines here for what our real business cycle looks like in U.S. history, and you might notice that the left side of the graph is there's much more variability over here than there is on the right side of the graph. One thing I want you to add into your notes, even though all we know about the business cycle is that we're going to have periods of rise and decline. Whatever goes down is going to come back up. Whatever is going up is going to come back down again. That's all we know, but we do not have a pattern. We cannot predict 3 things: frequency, duration, and intensity. You saw how jagged that line is for the business cycle in our country. We cannot make predictions on how often a recession is going to come. No one can make an exact prediction on how long a recession is going to be or how long a period of expansion is going to be. And no one can make exact predictions on how bad or how good it will be in the future. So be very wary of people who think that they can make exact predictions. A recession is when we see a decline in GDP, so that's actually going down. And remember, since the percentage change formula is the previous, this year's number minus the previous period's number divided by the previous period's number, if that number is actually going down and we have actually produced fewer goods and services than we did in the previous period, then we're going to have a negative growth rate. Let me just show you an example of what I mean when I keep saying that. Percentage change, any percentage change formula, if we're looking at for the inflation rate, if you're in chemistry and you're trying to see what happened when you mix 2 chemicals together, you're taking the new number minus the old number divided by the old number times 100. So if in this period we have made $15 trillion worth of goods and services, minus the previous periods, let's say that we only made $14 trillion worth of goods and services last year, just look at the numerator. If the new number is bigger than the old one, this whole thing is going to be positive. However, if we're making fewer goods and services in this period, in the new period, versus last year's GDP figures, I don't even have to work it out for you. You'll note 13 minus 14, we're going to have a negative number over here. So that's what it means with that negative growth rate. You know that GDP is actually declined. It used to be that a recession was defined by time. That if you had 2 consecutive periods of contraction in the economy, that was a recession. But now it's defined in terms of severity. So a very, very severe recession would be a depression. A growth recession is another definition, and that's when GDP is growing, but it's not as fast as we want it to be. So we're not meeting our goal. You could say right now that we are in a growth recession. We're not meeting our goal of 3%, but it's still a positive growth number. We've seen this term before, cyclical And you can see the word cycle in there, and it's dealing with the business cycle. When the economy is doing well, if we're in an expansion phase, the demand for which of these pairs of goods will increase. Well, durable goods are things that last 3 years or more, like a refrigerator or a car. Non-durable goods are things like clothing or food. So by definition, lasts shorter for fewer years. Or food obviously gets used up right away. So durable goods, if we are in a period of expansion, if people are optimistic about the future and they're thinking that they're going to have higher incomes in the future, we're going to see orders for refrigerators, dishwashers, appliances increase. And factory orders for those are going to increase when the economy is doing well. You might recall that normal goods and inferior goods, this depends on income. We buy more flat screen TVs, and those are considered normal goods when people have more money. When people have decreased income, then they'll buy more inferior goods. So when the economy is doing well, we'll see that sales of normal goods will increase. On the other hand, when the economy is not doing well, then we'll see more people going to dollar stores. And if you are interested in opening your business someday, you might, just remember and keep in mind that the economy is going to go through phases of growth and contraction. It's just going to alternate. And if you have a normal good, something that people buy when they have more money, maybe you could have a separate line or separate product where you might have another option. Luxury items, so yachts, private jets, RVs, when those things are doing well, when the economy is doing well, people buy more of those luxury items. Okay, laissez-faire, you might remember, this means leave it alone. The government should leave the economy alone. And that was really the prevailing idea in terms of how to handle the economy before the Great Depression. And you might recall from one of the previous slides, when I had that graph up there, the chart up there for the business cycle, we said it was more severe, there was more variability on the left side of the slide than the right side, and that was pre and during the Great Depression. Okay, let's see. Schiller, this economist, he makes a really strong statement here. He says the Great Depression destroyed the credibility of classical economics. That doesn't mean that we no longer talk about the invisible hand. We no longer talk about the market adjusting so that buyers and sellers can agree on a price. We still talk about that. We still believe in the power of that. It's just that it's not the only thing anymore that we're going to depend on. John Maynard Keynes' ideas really came into prominence during this time because he said it's not that the economy can't self-adjust. It can. Sometimes, but if it gets bad enough, the government should do something about it. So even today, we've got different schools of thought on the role of the government and how much the government should interfere with in the economy. John Maynard Keynes is actually famous for a quote, and he said, "In the long run, we're all dead." And what did he mean by that? Well, if you keep waiting and waiting for the economy to self-adjust, for things to get better, we're all going to be gone by then. So right now is the short run, and we should do something about it now in terms of policy. And we'll learn about fiscal and monetary policy in future chapters. Okay, so that's what the business cycle is, what it looks like on a graph, and some ways that we can we know that certain types of goods are going to be demanded more or less at different phases of the business cycle. What causes it? Well, these are three things that I'd like you to know: internal forces, external forces, and policy factors. Internal forces are things that happen inside our country. Maybe we have a bunch of people being born, and so we're going to have an increased demand for housing, clothes, food. All of that's going to be just because we have more people. If people are really, really scared about the future and are holding back and they want to save their money instead of spending it, that can affect our economy too. And a lot of people act in the same way in terms of what they do with their money. The second factor includes external forces. So this could be somebody declaring war on us, we're declaring war on someone else, and that would call for a lot of spending. Or you might recall the tsunami with Japan. That was a terrible natural disaster and definitely affected their economy. In terms of GDP, they were in second place, and Japan was in third. And after the tsunami, China's level of goods and services that they produced actually put them in second place and moved Japan to third. So that tsunami definitely did impact Japan's economy. Third factor, policy. That's a fancy way of saying something that the government does. This could be a law. This could be a program. It could be an incentive. It's something that the government has done. And like I said, we will talk about fiscal policy that deals with spending and taxes, and monetary policy that deals with interest rates and changing the money supply. So things that the government does definitely impacts our economy too. And this will make sense in the next chapter, but make sure you know everything on this slide. Those three factors, examples of those three factors, and also know that changes in these factors lead to shifts in aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which then affects GDP and then causes the business cycle. Hey, quick question. If we were to somehow be able to control for war, we had a long period of peace, had no natural disasters, no trade disruptions, would we still have the business cycle? Absolutely. Policy, actions by our government, internal market forces, consumer behavior, all of those things can change and still impact our economy and still cause our economy to grow and or contract. This was an interesting study that I learned about in grad school. These are two economists who proposed the idea that the business cycle, the American business cycle, was not only caused by what you would consider natural occurring factors, that incumbent presidents actually artificially stimulated the economy so that they would get reelected and be able to stay in office when it came to election time. Now, I do have to point out that they analyzed American presidential elections. But this was data from 1916 to 1978, so this was a long time ago. But all they used was economic data, like the growth rate of GDP, the inflation rate, and they were able to correctly predict the winning party, whether or not the incumbent was going to stay in office or not, for 15 out of 16 presidential elections from 1916 to 1978. And we have a separate entity now besides the president. We have the Federal Reserve, and their decision making is completely separate from Congress and the president. And so it would be difficult for the president to get away with doing such a thing now, artificially stimulate the economy to make themselves look good so they can get reelected. But the idea that people vote in a presidential election based on the economy is not so outdated, and the idea that a politician will do what's best for them to get reelected rather than what's best for the economy is not such an outdated idea either. A couple of other things you may have heard about. Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he was elected governor of California, he spoke at the the Republican convention when George W. Bush was the incumbent and was running for re-election. And you might remember that he got in trouble for giving a speech and saying, "Don't be economic girly men." A lot of people were upset with that statement, thought he was being homophobic. He came back and said he was actually referring back to an old Saturday Night Live sketch when Hans and Franz, these two kind of wimpy guys who couldn't lift as many weights as him, the bodybuilder, he was referring back to that and saying, don't be wimpy about the economy. Don't worry, and this was, you might remember this is in after 9/11, he was saying the economy will recover. He was referring to the business cycle. Yes, it's not that strong right now, but we're going to have a period of expansion eventually. And that's what he was referring to. Bill Clinton, when he was running against George Bush elder, when the elder George Bush was the incumbent president, Bill Clinton had a big sign in his what we call the war room, his headquarters, to remind everybody who was working on his campaign with him that it was the economy that was going to get him elected. And so he had a big sign that said, "It's the economy, comma, stupid," to remind everybody every day this was what was going to get him elected. And there were lots of similarities actually in that 92 election with this past election in 2012. Had large federal deficits back then and last year and now. President Bush tried to point out that technically the recession was over and the economy was on the right track, but that was a hard sell with unemployment averaging 7.6%. Now our unemployment rate was right about in the mid sevens as well last year. And he said, he blamed a Democratic Congress for blocking his recovery proposals, and he renewed his pledge of no new taxes. You might remember that he was famous for saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes," when he was running for president the first time. And he ended up having to break that promise. And boy, Bill Clinton made sure that every time he was interviewed to point that out, to remind everybody that Bush had to break his promise. But Clinton saw a more stronger role for government, and Bush saw a stronger role for the private sector. And you can see that Bush saw a more passive role, a more laissez-faire type thought of how the government government's role in the economy. And Clinton saw a more active role of the government. And during uncertain times, usually the public want a more active role. And in this case, Bush did not get to serve a second term, and Clinton was able to come in. Even though there were so many similarities between that election and last year's election of 2012, the Electoral College is something that it was another factor in this past election, and none of the government instructors upstairs were surprised that Obama won and was able to serve another term because of the Electoral College. So business cycle just describes our periods of rise and decline in our economy. Very, very important for businesses to think about, for consumers to think about, and also for presidents, and can play a role in a presidential election. So that's the business cycle.